With the resource problems largely out of the way, the game was finally in a functional place, in that I could start playing it without needing to worry about everything falling apart. The next problem to come up in the design process was much smaller, much less obvious, and even more troublesome. In fact, trying to fix this problem would cover over 4 major revisions to the core rules, and it led to me almost abandoning the game entirely. The problem was with one of the conceptual cores of the game, the life system and the Shadow Lord that was at the core of that system. As a quick side note, in the early versions of this game, the Eldritch Beings were referred to as reverses, as in the front and reverse of a card. Around this point in the design process, I wanted a term to refer to flipping a card from its front to its back, and reverse was just a perfect fit here. The Eldritch cards themselves were renamed to Shadows, and this felt like a better thematic fit on this side as well. I also finally settled on a tentative name for the game, Mirror World. You may have noticed both of these naming decisions in earlier videos on the game. This is the point in the design process I actually formally settled on these names instead of earlier placeholder names. In the game's current rules system, the game was functioning better, but with the field restricted to only 3 units at a time, hiding the Eldritch Lord was becoming difficult. I could up the field back up to 5 easily enough, but I would need to change the card economy to make sure that players are actually going to have enough cards to fill in this field. And this also brought in the danger of adding overall complexity to the field by adding more and more game pieces to it. These were changes that were possible, but there was a bigger problem looming over all of this that I was starting to notice the more games I was playing. The Shadow Lord was just not working as a life system or even as a central game concept. If all of your seals were unlocked, then it would only take a single attack to win once you found where the opponent was actually hiding their Lord. More realistically, you were able to find the Lord before reducing their regeneration shields all the way to 0, meaning that it would take a couple of attacks, but it would still only take a single turn to win. This didn't feel like the climax of a long campaign of building up resources and making strategic attacks before finally doing battle with a Lovecraftian nightmare. This felt more like you were directing a gang to mug some poor monster in the back alley to steal their lunch money. Rather than being an unstoppable force, the Eldritch Being was a weak monster that was lurking in the shadows and you actively didn't want it to appear in play. Playing through the first few turns of the game at this point in its design felt interesting, and there was definitely some good gameplay there. However, ending the game always felt like an anticlimactic letdown. My first attempt to fix this was to overhaul seals. The implementation of seals had been giving me trouble for a while, so I decided to flip them around a little bit. Instead of your seals gradually weakening the opposing Eldritch Lord, what if instead they were a lock on the power of your own Eldritch Lord? Each seal would represent an aspect of that Eldritch Lord breaking into reality piece by piece, stacking on new abilities until the 5th card revealed was the Lord itself, fully powered up with all of its abilities and ready to start attacking. Further, with this new system, there would be a proper life total, meaning that the Lord would no longer go down in just a single hit, but would take multiple attacks over several turns to wear down their strength to the point that they could again be sealed away. While I was making these changes, I also took the time to fix up the field limit. Players could only play their units in front of open seals, meaning that the field would gradually expand as the game progressed, starting with just 1 open seal, progressing all the way up to a maximum field size of 5. Theoretically, this would allow for the much larger field size, but since it was building up gradually over the course of the game, there was a lot less worry about field complexity, and more importantly, I didn't need to revamp the card economy to make it work. These changes would mean that the Lord was no longer hiding anywhere on your field. It was going to be an obvious, looming threat from turn 1 of the game. One problem that did come out of this was I was using dice for the life system as well as dice for the resource system. So to try and get around this, I briefly experimented with using a renewable system that let the fronts act like lands, but as before, a consumable system was just a much better fit and I quickly reverted back. This did mean that the game was back to using dice to track its resources, so to avoid the issue of having 2 separate dice tracks, I approached it from the other angle. Once your Eldritch Lord was revealed, you could put the other 4 unlocked seals beneath it, and that would be used as the life total. Sliding all of these cards under one another made the Lord feel like it was the sum of all of the parts that had just broken out of their seals. And since those cards were already in play, using them as a life total instead of bringing in a separate die was just a much cleaner implementation overall. This would mean that players couldn't deal damage until the Lord was actually revealed, which would lead to the early resource war and late attacking war play pattern that I was aiming for. This would also mean that the Lord cards would have to have enter effects primarily rather than continuous effects, but the continuous effects I'd been experimenting with were just proving annoying to track over gameplay anyways, so that was just a good change in either case. At this point, once again I had a functional game system, and most of its gameplay problems had largely been resolved. So of course, everything was fine now, right? Well, not so much. The game still had its unique elements of fronts and reverses that would flip between the two, but without the hiding Eldritch Lord as a game mechanic, this whole aspect of the game, fronts and reverses switching back and forth, was starting to feel more like window dressing, rather than a core gameplay mechanic that the game was really built around. The revamped life system and the central Eldritch Lord unit was certainly working, but it was starting to feel frustratingly similar to the Larig in Wicross, or the Vanguard unit in Cardfight Vanguard. In fact, the more I was focusing on and refining the mechanics of the Eldritch Lord, the less impressive it was starting to feel. Making defeating the Eldritch Lord as one of the core objectives of gameplay moved it from being an unknowable, unstoppable alien god to just an obstacle to be defeated. It didn't really matter if the flavor was you trying to seal it away rather than kill it. Mechanically, it felt like you were destroying it, and that really limited the impact it had on the flavor of the game. At this point, I was on the 5th rules revision, and it felt like I was still very far away from properly capturing the flavor of front characters living and working in a modern city, while supernatural battles were happening in the shadows just beneath the surface. The groundwork that had gone into the game was just not falling into place, and the more I worked on it, the more I felt like I was just imitating Wicross with an extra bit of window dressing. I was starting to wonder if there wasn't enough in this design worth saving, if it would honestly just be better to scrap the project and try something new. I did end up putting this game on the back burner for a little bit while I tried out another TCG system, and while that system didn't end up working out, it did let me experiment with a few new ideas that I could bring back into Mirror World when I did another major rework of the game system. I'll go over this rework in the next video, but it was the big breakthrough that the game needed, and it finally put it in a place that I was happy with. Good luck as you work through all the problems in your games, big and small, and have a fantastic day.